Hi, everyone. This is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today we have a very exciting episode. We're going to be talking about excommunication, belonging, and sibling estrangement. Now, excommunication is one of the most difficult experiences we can have in our family because it really magnifies the sense of being cast out. And when a sibling hijacks the family narrative and corrupts our relationships with other family members, it can end up turning against us. Now, in this video, we'll discuss the phenomenon of modern day excommunication within families, the psychological toll this takes on us, given our need to belong, and how it is that we can take back our power over our lives. So, Fern, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks. It's great to be with you. Really, we're so devoted to this question of estrangement and excommunication, but there can be sometimes a silver lining in it. And I actually saw something on the page today, which I found quite moving, and that was that someone posted that in the midst of estrangement, she was able to forge a friendship with another member of the community. And they actually, the two, met in person in England and were able to share a hug. And it's a good reminder that as painful as all this is, there are opportunities for belonging and connection.
That's such a great story that came up online, especially in one of the Facebook groups that I host and of course that you're a part of. It's wonderful to be able to see these stories come out and how it is that people can experience that much needed sense of belonging with one another. And it's a great lesson to see that it can happen in all sorts of ways outside of family and such. And, I think that this is really important. And this is a good segue into what we want to talk about, right? This idea that, when somebody takes control or hijacks the family, and this is a difficult experience for a number of us, because I think that what happens here, especially, is that siblings can all of a sudden start to take control of that narrative over all the other types of narratives. And what happens is that despite the facts, they'll try to enforce their own way of seeing things, foster an us versus them scenario. And unfortunately, what that does is it can of course amplify past incidences. You and I were talking about that just before the video, and it could be creating all sorts of experiences of distortion. And of course, through repetition, what ends up happening is that people can end up believing a lie or have something become exaggerated more than it actually happened and such in the past. And I think that that's the thing that's really important here is to be able to recognize that if we're not careful, we can all of a sudden start to be included in some of these scenarios. We can have the label of black sheep, right? And we can be marginalized. And it could just basically go downhill and culminate into what we've seen through other members in our community as being excommunication from a family, right?
Excommunication, scapegoating, triangulating, gaslighting, all of these things may come into play. And if you're on the receiving end of that, it is of being marginalized, it is devastating. Part of the reason it's so devastating is belonging is a fundamental, crucial need, which
Mm-hmm.
has been identified by the great psychologist Abraham Maslow. And he basically created that hierarchy of needs. And it's a color-coded weighted pyramid of basic human requirements. And it's belonging is what, second to the top there? It's pretty high up.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a fundamental need that we have as people, especially. And I think historically, people got together through tribes and such to be able to foster that sense of belonging. And I think that that's the thing that's really important is we can't dismiss that. Even though we may have been excommunicated or banished from our family without necessarily knowing why, sometimes it's apparent, sometimes it's not, it's still a fundamental need that all of us have. And it's good also to recognize what it is that sometimes causes this within families, right? I think that what happens is there's this notion of implied hierarchies. And I think that that's the thing that happens with this, is that there's certain people's voices have more importance within the family structure than other members, right? And this is the thing that happens sometimes, especially when siblings are in competition with one another. And sometimes this is done openly. Other times it's done in a subtle type of way, where the black sheep can be unheard, feel as though they're less important, excluded, which in turn can give them a sense of feeling as though they're dismayed, they're bewildered by how they're being treated and what's happening to them. There can be an experience of shock, and marginalization is the word we used, of course. So these type of situations do happen. And I think that that's the thing that we really need to be careful, because it can be very blatant and it can be done in an active type of way. And also, it can be done in such a way that is also passive, right? So you've got both of these methods in some ways where things are very done very overtly, harshly, in a confronting and demeaning way. And you've got the passive way where all of a sudden it's more subtle, where communication may break down, where there can be withdrawal and shunning and such. And I think that's the thing that's important here, is the hurt that leaves us, the betrayal, often left without answers and such, that causes this amongst people that are excommunicated.
Right, and we're social animals. We have this deep, deep need to be a part of a group. And the reason is, if back in the day, if you weren't part of a group, you couldn't survive. So it's in our DNA. Um, and I often think about horses and how they organize themselves. It's the same idea, that they are part of a group and they have to have that group in order to survive as a group.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at everything, right? You look at every single aspect of life. It's often composed in a systemic type of way, right? And that's the thing that happens, right? There's letters, there's words, there's sentences, there's paragraphs. There's always something bigger and bigger that happens, of course. And I think that that's also very, very true when it comes to that. The idea of coming together as a group is very important. And unfortunately, there can be what we were talking about previously, about the weaponization of some of these groups, right, against certain people if they don't conform, right? And I think that there's been a lot of work done when it comes to cults, for example, right? And how it is that type of mindset can very much be used against individuals to get them to somehow conform and to erase their own personal identity.
There's the concept of the family myth too. So if you do not conform to what that myth is, what is the family identity? If you have a different sexual orientation, if you choose a partner who is outside this concept, anything that deviates from how the family sees itself, you run the risk of being cast off. And actually, it's really painful to discuss, but read some work about the LGBTQ plus community, and the numbers of estrangement in that group is shockingly high. And it's exactly this, that they are not conforming to the family myth or the family identity.
Yes, exactly. The family narrative and such, right? And
Right. Right.
unfortunately, what happens is that some people can get really good at knowing what the family rules are, the family expectations are, and then if they can use that against other people and such for their own personal gain, then it becomes a big problem. And this is where estrangement and excommunication can happen, of course, you know? So, yeah,
And I wanted to add, and you have said this before, but these sibling relationships are really competitive. And when the slightest thing can really offset these relationships off balance. So even just differing incomes, different lifestyles, those things can disturb the connection.
absolutely, absolutely. When there's a precariousness that comes in, or that's being used in such a way as to put pressure on individuals, it's sad and unfortunate, but it can, in the worst cases, lead to excommunication and banishment within the family structure. So, Fern, let's talk about the importance in reclaiming ourselves. And I think that's really something that's key for our viewers. And talking about that is especially important because a lot of times there can be a lot of parallels with people that, for example, have exited cults and such, you know. And I found that a lot of times in the literature, it seems to be that there's a lot of different uh, tools and a lot of different perspectives that can help people to regain that sense of their selves, you know, amidst being excommunicated and such, you know. So I think there's a lot of resources out there, of course, when it comes to reading more about this. But I think for us, for the interest of our community, relating to social connections is really, really important. That's number one, right? And like you were saying, you gave this wonderful example in the beginning, right? Strong, positive relationships with those that want us in their lives, you know, precisely to give us that much needed validation, acceptance, and encouragement, right? And that can be done through coworkers, friends, other family members that can give us that sense of belonging, especially, right?
Right. Socialization is really, really important. I always say skate to the puck, go where you're valued.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and I think that that's one of the things I was just listening to today as I was driving up to work. This idea of course, finding your group, finding your community, right? And that's another thing also that they suggest as well with regards to this idea of community and cultural identity to be able for people to find themselves might be, for example, getting involved with, you know, if you have certain aspects of your culture that you'd like to deepen in some ways to root yourself more in, for example, or your particular ethnicity, a shared language, values, or traditions. You know, even getting involved in one's community, like, for example, going into daycare, helping others, for example, in that way, gardening, or some other purpose, really, that can really help. Because when you look at the blue zones in the world, for example, a lot of times what allows people to live longer is that sense of being involved in their community, right? In a cause that's worthy, that gives people purpose. And I think that social activities can be a good way to foster that.
And actually, I think it's a lot easier to connect to people when you have a shared activity. So it makes sense that you would pursue some of these things. I was also going to add, it's really important in reclaiming yourself to become aware of those negative core beliefs and to start to reframe so that you see yourself outside of those core beliefs.
Exactly, right? Reinstating and validating critical thinking, especially, right? So
Mm.
that's really, really important, of course, recognizing those beliefs, recognizing the implied power structures, and even the possibility of narcissism involved in what can cause some of these banishments and excommunications. And it's important to recognize our ability to think independently and working on certain thoughts, you know, that can typically be associated to some families, for example, where it can be like extremist in their own thinking. Like all of a sudden, it's people can realize, oh, okay, my family was very much in the all or nothing thinking pattern,
Mhm.
or some other type of thinking pattern that causes people to be pulled in some extremes where invariably they're going to disagree. And that can be perpetuated by a particularly unhealthy family system or a sibling in order to somehow reclaim their position and strengthen their position at our own detriment, of course.
Yeah, getting familiar with some of those narcissistic personality traits is probably extremely valuable for those who are estranged. As I've said in the past, I find a very high percentage of estrangement is rooted in somebody somewhere in the family who's narcissistic.
Mm-hmm. It can certainly play into that type of egocentrism and such. You know, talking with other people also that have gone through similar experiences can also be very helpful when it comes to excommunication or banishment. And I think that once you get to see how it is with others, there's a sense of reassurance in knowing that we're not alone, right? And it can be challenging, you know, when we see others going through similar issues, but it can also help to build confidence and resiliency in ourselves. And that's why I do the sibling estrangement support group online, precisely for that reason, so that there can be a space where people can have that sense of validation and mirroring, especially that's important in showing that we're not alone.
Right, and I've told you this before, but almost every email I receive starts out with the same first line. I thought I was the only one.
Hmm. Right?
Hardly, hardly, hardly.
Exactly, right? And we find our tribe, just like we've been saying, right? And that's often how I start when I let people in our the Facebook group is welcome to our tribe. And I think
Mhm.
that's such an important a notice to give to people by recognizing the fact that they do have, of course, kindred souls that get to understand what they're going through. And another thing that helps for us to reclaim ourselves is to work through difficult emotions, right? Now, estrangement and excommunication can leave us with a sense of shame or guilt, as you and I have mentioned before. And especially when we experience a sense of being cast out, these are all normal feelings, and it can be important to work through them through a narrative approach or other types of therapeutic approaches with people familiar with how to treat estrangement and such.
Well, that's the problem, actually. There are many who go to therapists and find that they know very little about estrangement, and that can be pretty frustrating, which is why your page is so valuable, because
Yeah.
finally we find others who are experiencing the same thing.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you, Fern. I think that's important. And one final point I want to make, of course, when it comes to reclaiming ourselves, is quite simply making the use of creativity and art. The
Mhm.
self expression we gain through creativity is, by its very nature, uncensoring and very freeing for ourselves. And it can really help to channel and make sense of an estrangement or excommunication experience within a family, even beyond the use of words. So creating a safe space within ourselves through art is really, really good because it helps to get gain a healthy way to explore the grief behind estrangement or excommunication for ourselves.
Yeah, I really believe those creative arts are healing. But one thing you didn't mention, and one thing I think a lot about as well, is exercising. And, we talk about all these ways to achieve well-being, but exercise it's becoming more and more clear in the research that it changes everything. So, and another great way to meet people.
Absolutely. And actually, very brisk exercise or even low intensity type of exercises have been shown to actually extend life as well. So when they look at all the centenarians, they see oftentimes that people have a type of lifestyle that facilitates that, that does make room for exercise. So that's a great point. For when we're not sure what to do, even just going for a brisk walk or something, really helps us uh,
Mhm.
especially just to clear our minds and such, you know. So, Fern, we're almost out of time. So, I think we're going to be just talking about resources, of course, just so our readers can know where they can go, what they can do, of course. So, what would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, along those lines, narrative therapy. And that brings me to the Sibling Estrangement Journal, which is a collection of posts about sibling estrangement with questions and prompts so that you can write your way through the grief.
That's a great resource. Yes, I agree. Wonderful resource. My number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. And that's going to be starting up again this fall. And it's going to be twice monthly. If some people are interested in partaking in that, they can. I am also currently hosting an intensive workshop that people can have with me if they want to go deeper with cutting edge tools to help with their sibling estrangement. They can certainly join me this fall as well to be able to partake in that if they want to go deeper still. So that's very, very important for our viewers to know that there are resources that we are offering so that people can, of course, experience more of a sense of empowerment, self knowledge, and of course, acknowledgement with everything that's going on. So do take a look at the resources on screen. They are helpful and they can be places where you can go, especially to gain more knowledge and empowerment for yourselves when it comes to sibling estrangement. So, Fern, thank you so much for doing this. I'm very happy with this episode. I'm very glad that we got a chance to discuss this topic that has been in the works, I think, for a long time. So, thanks again for doing this.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
I'll talk to you soon.